I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be talking with Alafair Burke, thriller author extraordinaire of Find Me, The Better Sister, The X. There's so many. You have writing in your blood, and you have so much real-world experience that just makes your book something really, really special. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about it.
So we're here to talk about The Note, which is, as soon as I saw the premise, I was like, okay, I'm intrigued. You've got me. And I was hoping that you could give us the little elevator pitch for the book, because I will say up front, we're not going to do spoilers because there are some great twists and turns in here. So it's a spoiler-free conversation.
So 3 friends, May, Lauren, and Kelsey, they've known each other since childhood, but they haven't seen each other in IRL, in real life for a while. They're just constantly texting each other, and they make space for each other to go meet out in the Hamptons for a little, weekend girls trip. And then someone really makes them mad, and they leave a nasty little note, just in a petty moment to amuse themselves. And then things go terribly awry, and they find themselves in the middle of a police investigation.
I think this plot is so genius because as I was reading and sort of getting into the setup, it really makes you think of all those moments where you do something and you don't realize the possible impact it could have. Like one little choice can set off this runaway train of events.
Those are some of my favorite stories because I think when I first started writing, I did a lot of the good guys versus the bad guys stuff. And, you can only do that so long. I mean, I think some of my favorite stories to read and to write are ones where people who are relatively good people mess up. They make one false move, they do one thing they're not necessarily thinking of, and then the so-called, butterfly effect takes off, and you're suddenly on a very different road.
I wonder, was it that piece that came to you first? Was that the inception for all of this? Because there are so many moving pieces in The Note. There's a lot of things that are kind of wrapped together. But was that decision sort of where you're like, I want to write about this?
Yeah, but I always talk about my plots. It's almost like I'm matchmaking in my head because I'll have a plot idea and I'll have a character idea, and I kind of need to marry them together. It needs to be the right setup, the right characters, and the right twists, a big crimey plot and stuff. And then they need to find each other in my head. A weird way to describe it, but that's how I think of it. But the kind of setup part of it came from something I did with my friends. And a group of women went on a vacation and someone stole their parking spot. And to amuse ourselves, we were sitting writing notes at the bar, while we glared at their car, saying how much we wanted to key it. But of course, we would never do that. And so petty. And one person wrote a very earnest note, you saw us waiting and you took it, and that wasn't very nice. And then one of us, just to amuse the other people, at this point, it became the waitress was talking to us about it, the people at the table next door, it became a stupid thing. And one of us wrote a note to make the other people laugh. What if we left a note that said, he's cheating on you? And then the weird thing happened. We left the napkins on the table. When we came back, someone had left that napkin on the car. We think it was someone next to us. Someone took it one step further. And when we were what should we do? And well, we don't want to go remove it from the car because then we're near the car because they could have already seen it. So it became this whole thing in our head. And when we were driving back, I was like, what is going to happen when they find that note? And I just kind of couldn't let that idea drop of just, you do something so stupid. And of course, the person who sees it doesn't know if it's a joke or not, right? It could start something. So that's my only spoilers, the note, but it's in the title.
It is. And you find out so early about some of those things. And I feel like that is such a small piece of this huge web that it ends up. I mean, there are so many pieces, and I had such a great time sort of just like you were saying, you have this sort of formula that you use of characters and plot and setups. I feel like that's how I was reading it. I was I felt like I was in front of one of those big boards with the strings connecting different things as I was going through. I was like, okay, I love to try to figure out the plots, but I also try to like be really chill about it because I think that's so much of the balancing act of reading a thriller is like I want to figure out some things, but I also want to be really surprised.
Yeah. That's the best kind of feeling of like, I think I noticed that, but I'm not going to think too hard about it. Like, I think this is what's happening, but you know, hopefully you don't know.
Yeah, I love as much as it gets me. I love when I'm really confident about what I think something is going to be, and then I am completely wrong.
It's a good feeling. Although you feel, then you're, to me, the best kind of ending is one where you didn't see it coming, but once it hits you, you're like, of course that's what it was. Like, why
Mhm.
didn't I see it? And yet I didn't. Yeah.
Yes, I love the like back and forth of like having to like close the book for a second and be like, is that what I okay? Did I just read that? And then I like can't keep the book closed for very long because I need to know and go back in. But I think that that's something in writing that travels across all genres, but is like so diluted down in the thriller space. This idea where you have to know your reader so well. You have to know the kinds of things that they're going to want, the kinds of things that are going to work for them, because you're a thriller reader. I feel like they know when they go in what they want.
I wish I knew what thriller readers wanted because I actually think sometimes you make a mistake as an author trying to guess what the audience wants, trying to satisfy an audience you make up in your head because you might wind up, I don't know, doing something somebody else has already done or trying to chase an audience that may not be there for you. I've always loved crime novels. I love suspense. I love a good twist. I know what I like to read, and I assume I'm not alone. I read a lot of bestsellers. So I try to write a book that I think would satisfy me and the kind of readers I've talked to. Instead of trying to guess what other people might like. But I try to have that satisfying twist.
I think I came to thriller novels late. I started very much like as like a younger person, I was very into like crime fiction. Like I really liked detective stories and mysteries and I still do, but and then I feel like it's a natural transition, I guess, to starting to read thriller. But once I started, I was like, oh, there's a whole other world here of this like this space where there is like in your work there is still lawyers, there are still police officers, there's still
Yeah.
crime, but there's just this added element to it as well.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of think of them a bit as hybrid books because I started out writing what most people would probably call procedurals. My first series, I was a deputy district attorney in Portland, Oregon, and my first three books featured a prosecutor as the main character named Samantha Kincaid. And then I wrote another series set in New York after I moved here, featuring Detective Ellie Hatcher, who's an NYPD homicide detective. And even in those books, I would often switch points of view so that you were getting not just the investigators, overview of the case and what their perspective was, but you would see inside the mind of the people who were most affected by the crime that they were investigating. And I just think over time, I sort of flipped it a little bit more. So my current books still have a procedural aspect to it. You have scenes with police detectives, doing the detectiving, but you're mostly living inside the minds of the people who are living it and have the most at stake. And I've enjoyed that pivot a lot.
It makes it so much more interesting to read, I think, when you can really get inside the heads of the
Yeah.
characters. And I know in the past I've had some people that I've spoken to that really think that anything in the mystery thriller genre, it's not really about characters. It's about plot. It's about the X, Y, and Z, this is what happened. But I think some of the very best mysteries and thrillers are really about characters. And I find that in your work.
Thank you so much. It's a compliment to me because I think character's king. I mean, I've read some great twisty mysteries where the plots are delicious and it's like, oh, that's a good twist. I wish I thought of that. But the minute I'm done, like it was never about the characters. I'm like, I just want to know what happened. Like, I just want to see what this clever storyteller is doing here with these components to the story. For me, the best kind of books, like I said, it's like the plot has to be good, but the plot has to be one that highlights what's going on with that character at that moment and vice versa. Like this plot could work if you plugged in three other women, but it wouldn't work in the same way. Like the situation that they're thrown into together is like a pressure point for all of their personalities, both individually and the tensions among each other.
And so I'd love to talk a little bit about these characters, specifically about May, because I really loved reading about her. I have not encountered a character like her in a thriller novel before. And so I was so intrigued to be like, how is she going to respond to these situations? And sometimes I was like, uh-oh, that is not how I would have responded to that situation. But that makes it interesting and compelling, and her character is just so interesting. And I wonder if you could talk about finding her character and her voice.
Yeah. So May Hanover she was raised by a single mother who's a Chinese immigrant. Her father wanted nothing to do with her, and she's always had to be a little scrappy. I mean, she was middle class at best, and kind of finding her way in the world, and very ambitious. She was a talented musician. It's an arts camp where these three women meet each other as children, but she also has a big fat brain. And through academics, she became a lawyer. She's very ambitious and isn't always able to satisfy that, and that creates a lot of anxiety in her. I mean, I think she's a perfectionist to a fault, to the point that some people might find her annoying. Like, just she wants to be perfect at all times. She can't leave anything undone. She's a little rule follower. Her friends call her like the little sheriff, like she's a little, tattletale. and and being a rule follower, not necessarily the best place for her. Like, that's not the best characteristic given the situation that they find themselves in, right? So like when the police show up at their door, like she wants to go tell all, even though she's a lawyer, she should know better. And her friends are like, what are you doing? Like, what, this cop's not your friend, even though you used to be a prosecutor. So she's got that going on. She's a control freak. She's always been very successful for the most part, but she's going through some stuff. She's having a lot of anxiety post-pandemic. It's not a book about the pandemic, but it is about her kind of struggling of like, why do I not have the same energy I used to have? And why don't I like big groups anymore? Like, she's kind of still coming out of that. And then the big thing is that she had a viral moment where you can't give too much away, but what all three of these women have in common and what kind of brought them back together in the recent past is that they all went through something on social media where strangers talked about them and strangers thought they had some conception of them, and the three of them have sort of helped each other cope with that. So she had a moment that kind of got her labeled a Karen in the vernacular, and she's having to deal with that, her guilt over that, and also her kind of paranoia of, wow, do people really see me that way? Am I that way? So there's a lot of identity issues, I think, going on in the book.
And that for me really makes this story so rich and interesting, is that, yes, we've got this incredible plot with all these moving pieces. And I really found myself caught up in this group of women and just really wanting to understand how they had gotten to where they were, why they had chosen to respond in the ways that they did. And I think it's also this very interesting look at friendship in the kind of world that we live in, where trust and responsibility to each other and to the public and to, ourselves is kind of under scrutiny. And I loved watching these women deal with navigating how they relate to each other, how they trust each other, how they trust the world at large, I guess. It was really interesting.
Yeah, I think you've kind of nailed what I was trying to do. Like, there's a lot, because you've got three different women and they all have their own conceptions of what they think the right thing to do is. They also have their own self-perception, right? Because like May, for example, is a rule follower. She's like, I'm the one who's going to help the police. And they're kind of like, mind your own business. This has nothing to do with us. So they all have their own ideas of how they fit in to their obligations, but it also brings out tensions among, like, unstated tension among the three of them. Of, you realize that even though they've kind of been teasing her by calling her the little sheriff, that they are kind of judging her. They're like, oh my God, here she goes. May's going to May again. Like, I forgot, right? When you don't see somebody for a long time and you're just texting each other and then you're back together in real life, it's like, oh yeah, I forgot that you can be a lot, or I forgot that you're that way. And so they kind of start to go at each other, and it's a test of their loyalty to each other.
And I love seeing the way that they interact is so funny as well. I mean, I think a lot of times in fiction in the world, we see women pitted against each other. And not to say that there aren't moments where there's conflict between these women, but I love watching their actual friendship and the moments where they come back. And there were so many moments where I was like, oh yeah, this does feel like my millions of group chats that I have with my friends with silly names, and we all have, different things that bring us together.
Yeah, I think most people, if you're somebody with a group of friends in the group chat, like the nonstop thread, I think people will relate to the relationship with these three women because they don't diss each other, like they don't backstab each other, but they are real about each other. Like they don't tell each other that they're always right. Like they're willing to call each other out. And those are kind of some of my favorite scenes to write, is like when someone needs to hear, they might need a read and these women are willing to dish it out to each other, but it's always out of love, of sort of like, hey, why are you being this way? Like we owe it to you to tell you you're wrong right now.
I think that really comes into sort of the timeliness of this novel as well. Like you said, this isn't a pandemic novel. It doesn't feel like, oh, this is an analysis of this time, but
Yeah,
I think fiction, and I say genre fiction in like air quotes because I have, there's a lot going on under that umbrella. But I think it's something people recognize as a statement. But there is this great opportunity in things like horror and thrillers and mystery and fantasy to analyze some of these things that are going on in our society in a way that feels a little bit more accessible for readers. And I think you really are able to do that with so many of the social media aspects, the post-pandemic changes in personality. So how did you choose to add in those elements as you were writing?
Yeah, I never do it in an intentional way, but it takes me about a year to write a book from conception to turning it in for editing, I would say. And I'm interested in a lot of things, and it's not just the characters and it's not just the plot. I look around at the world and I notice some stuff, and it tends to work its way in there. And so, given how much time we all spend online, like I'm an addict. I will admit it. Follow me on all the things, but I enjoy it and I get a lot of information that way. But we're not processing information in the traditional ways, right? Like everybody can be a reporter now. Everybody can be a photographer. Everybody, and these three women have been through it because of that. Because in one case, somebody's a true crime message board fodder, like the other had a relationship that got outed and judged, and then May has her little viral Karen moment. And it's probably not great that private citizens get put through the mill that way as entertainment for people who just want to have something to say online. So I'm like, that sort of worked its way into the story, and I never really do it intentionally. I knew that May was going to be dealing with anxiety, and so that's what turned it into the Karen moment. I could see how you don't want to be judged on your very worst day, right? And that's what happened to her.
And it really presents things in a way that, it's not. I think a lot of times when we encounter this kind of information, it can feel very like being hit over the head with these are all the common problems, these are all the things, and we all know. It's like we all live in society, we know, but sometimes when we're able to read fiction and we're able to analyze things through somebody else's lens, it clicks in different ways. And I think it allows us to like get empathy for people who are going through different things, or, even something where if we were just told about a, general person, we'd be like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. But then to read it in fiction, it allows us to go, oh yeah, I can understand.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also a way to make the characters different and less generic than just like three ladies on vacation. Like, I mean, they're all going through different challenges, and that becomes part of the character. And it's not that the book is about those challenges, but if readers find it interesting, then which I do, then that's kind of a bonus. Yeah.
I think it helps us connect with the story. It raises the stakes. I'm so much more interested in what's going to happen to these people when I'm like, oh yeah, there's not just a name on a page. I empathize with that person as well.
Well, and they're also, these three women, even though they're kind of in similar places now that they're all grown, like they're all very successful and comfortable, but to different degrees. They grew up in different classes, right, with different degrees of access to information and access to wealth. and they're three different races. And that was done intentionally. It's not a book about race, but it is a book that shows that it's, those issues don't go away. And even though it's not something they think about constantly, they don't think about their differences. They think about their friendship, right? They just know each other as May, Kelsey, and Lauren. That particularly when it comes to dealing with police, right? They have very different attitudes about that. I didn't necessarily set out to do that, but I knew the characters would have different backgrounds, but it's not just a way of just backstory. It found its way into the present in ways that surprised me. I was like, of course they're going to see a police investigation differently. And I didn't really know that until I got to that scene. I was like, oh yeah, no, Lauren's going to see this differently than May.
I think it goes to that in the past, there hasn't been as much access to diversity. I think especially in crime and thriller writing, I think we're seeing a lot of growth. I know that there's such a wealth of different stories now, but I think traditionally, especially in a lot of procedural writing, there is a very narrow idea of these are the types of characters there are. And to get a new perspective and some new people writing and telling stories, it really allows us to have more access to stories that reflect the actual reality for people.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's some responsibility to that too, right? You can't just write a character just like yourself and then change their skin color so that you have diversity on the page. If you're going to do it, I think you really have to think carefully about does their racial background matter, and if so, how is it going to manifest itself in either character or plot? So hopefully, I did that. Okay.
There's a lot to love and to think about with these characters. I found myself, even after I finished the book and I knew what happened and I knew how it ended, I was like, man, I just hope they're all okay.
Well, I can't say.
I know.
I'm glad you were rooting for them, though. That's better than when you read a book and it's like, oh, I want this person to get theirs.
And I was primarily rooting for Gomez the pug.
Yes, Gomez the pug is a good doggy. That's May's dog. He's glued to her at all times, follows her all around, and he's loosely based on my French bulldog who's sitting over here. I've had so many French bulldogs in my books because I have had two French bulldogs over the last, I guess, 19 years. Not one dog. My one dog is 12 and a half, so I'm doing pretty well with that one. But I love those dogs. They're just little clowns, but so are pugs. So I'm like, okay, I'll have Gomez could be a pug instead of a French bulldog.
And I think I really enjoyed the police aspect of this story as well. The prosecutor's office, the district attorney, and I know that you have a lot of experience in this world in your own life. And I wonder how if you could talk a little bit about your career outside of writing and how it sort of influences your work.
Yeah, so I went to law school. Some people probably know my father's a writer named James Lee Burke. He's written a couple books and I hear they're good. But I kind of most writers are like, oh, my passion was to be a writer, but my parents wanted me to be a lawyer or a doctor. In my house, it was the other way around. My dad's like, you're going to be a writer. You're going to be a writer. Because I always read a lot and I write little short stories when I was a kid. But when your parents tell you you're going to do what I do, the rebel in me is like, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a lawyer. So I very much enjoy being a lawyer. I'm still a lawyer. Inevitably, when I did go to law school, I'm like, oh, should I work for the Southern Poverty Law Center? Should I be an entertainment lawyer? My thoughts were all over the place. And after I clerked for a federal judge, I was like, oh, gosh darn it. The thing I really like is crime, because I'd always read crime fiction and I had always been obsessed with kind of true crime. I'm like, oh my gosh, what unites it all is crime. So I became a prosecutor, and I was prosecutor in Portland, Oregon for about 5 years. And I did primarily domestic violence cases. And I also worked as an advisor to the police department. I worked directly out of a precinct, what was called in the 90s, neighborhood-based prosecution unit for a couple of years. And I learned so much there, even more than trying cases. You kind of see how it really works out there outside of the courthouse. So that experience, I think, worked its way into my books a lot. And then while I was at the DA's office, I was still reading tons of crime fiction. And I kind of realized every time a prosecutor would show up on the page in a crime novel, it was like, oh, just skip the next few pages because it would just get really boring. And they'd be like, hearsay, objection, you need a warrant. And it was all just the technical stuff. It wasn't showing the stuff that I thought was really interesting about the life of a prosecutor and the discretionary calls they make and how they're doing things. The most interesting things happen outside of the courthouse. So all of a sudden I was like, oh, I have an idea for a book. And I'm like, oh, my dad was right. I guess I'm going to be a writer. I thought I would write one book, that I would keep in my office. By then I was a law professor. I'm still a law professor at Hofstra Law School, Long Island. But I thought it would be one, and I was lucky that multiple editors wanted it. It went to auction, but my agent called me, and they were like, they want to know whether it's a series. And I was like, is it supposed to be a series? Is it not supposed to be a series? He's like, yeah, because this is when everybody was really into series books. They're like, yeah, they're assuming it's a series. I'm like, it's definitely a series, just like I planned it. And sure, I can write more books. So I kind of found myself with a contract I hadn't been looking for. So I'm like, I can definitely write one more. And then there was a contract for two more. And I've kind of always, I think I had probably written 8 or 9 books before my husband was the one who noticed. He was like, when people ask you what you do, you used to always say you were a law professor, and you wouldn't. And now when people ask you what you do, you say you're a writer. And I was like, oh, I guess I made that switch at some point. So I'm both, but yeah. So I'm comfortable with the idea that I'm not just writing one book at a time to see what happens.
Yeah, I think you're at a certain point where you're like, uh-oh, I've accidentally gotten a career.
This is my actual career now. I have 2 careers.
And your dad is like, I told you all along.
Yeah, there is that.
I love the idea of people who come from arts households who try to do like a practical thing. I love just the idea that people are like, this is I can't possibly do that. When most people are like, so they don't maybe see art as like a career. They don't know that you can really do that. And I love getting to talk to authors who have come from so many different places and now are all, creating these great things that we get to read. And all these different life experiences really shade the books that get put out. It's really great.
Yeah, my mom was a librarian too. She was a school librarian, and so it was kind of a combination of, because my dad was not by any means an instant success. I mean, he was a professor at the same time, so I really have followed in all their footsteps. But he would write on the weekends primarily, or in the afternoons after teaching his classes, and my mom would take me to the library every Saturday morning to kind of give him uninterrupted writing time. My siblings were older than me, so I guess they were running around terrorizing the neighborhood or something. I'm like, where were they on all those Saturdays when I had mom day? But dad would have the house to himself so that he could write. But yeah, my mom, by doing that, I realized that she kind of helped his writing career, but also began mine.
There's no place better than a library.
Yeah, magical places.
Certainly. And I love that you also were like, am I writing standalones? Am I writing series? I think that there's like this great freedom in getting to write standalones because you can kind of just like leave it all on the page. Mm-hmm. But then there's also something in series, and you've collaborated with Mary Higgins Clark, and you've done all these like great opportunities. Do you feel now that you gravitate more towards one or the other? Or are you ready to be like, I'll write, who knows what I'll write?
Yeah, I'm a little who knows what I'll write. I've got this crazy idea for like this dystopian book set in like, I think it's an amazing idea. And everybody I try to talk to about, they're like, you literally dreamt this, right? And I'm like, but I'll keep that to myself so people don't think I'm insane. But, I think what tethers the work really is, it's character driven crime novels, but I do think I'm doing something a little unusual because there's procedural aspects to books that might otherwise be called psychological suspense or domestic suspense. But I think that just comes naturally to me. Like, I like to flip around points of view, and working with, you mentioned Mary Higgins Clark, the queen of suspense, who I miss greatly. It was a real honor to be able to work with her towards the end of her career. And I think what brought us together is she had been looking for somebody to co-author with, and I don't know who she talked to, but I think I showed up, end of Act 1. And it's hard she's not somebody who plots out in advance, and neither am I. And so we were like, it's hard to co-author with somebody if there's not a plan. And so we were kind of talking about process and how we do things. And when we both landed on character comes first and the character will show you the plot, like we were like, oh, okay, that might show us the way. And so we were like, well, let's try writing 3 chapters together, and then we could kind of see where the book would go from there. And we always did that. And so, it was nice to be able to have that experience with her. And it taught me to, I think, be a more disciplined storyteller to some extent, because even though even with the 2 of us together, there wasn't really an outline, but we would start with character and let that show you the way, but to kind of have a better idea of where you're going, instead of just like, I have to write 1,000 words a day, so I'm going to write 1,000 words, even if they're not leading anywhere. Like, I don't do that anymore, and I used to.
I get that. I always wonder too, especially when there is something like thrillers and they have this really like direct line. If there is a lot of things that end up sort of on the cutting room floor, like I always wonder if there's like twists and turns that you're like, I can't fit it in here, but I'm going to keep it in here for maybe the next book. That kind of twist will come.
For years, I kept a cut materials file because I used to overwrite, because like I said, I would just, plus when I first started, I think I was very into the procedural stuff because, I know the legal landscape better than probably a lot of people are who aren't lawyers. And so I would and I find that stuff interesting. So instead of just somebody deciding they didn't need a warrant to go to the next step of the investigation, like I would have a whole scene where they would go to court and litigate the reasons why they didn't need a warrant or something. And I would never do that now. I would just, the only thing you need to know is they went into the house and what they found. So I would take out those scenes, and I don't like waste, right? Just like my fridge is full of leftovers and God knows anyone's going to ever eat them. I'm like, I can't waste this great seed. And so I had a folder that I would dump stuff in, and I'd get it out. And I'm like, yeah, there's a reason I cut that. So I don't do that anymore. Once it's gone, it's gone.
I think that makes sense. And the idea of like, well, I something I really love about the note is just how like quick and tight and fast it is, just flows through. Even though there is a lot going on, you don't give us a lot of time to catch our breath in between, a big event and a big event. And I think that really helps move things through. But it also, like, there were moments where I was like, I think only like 8 hours has passed in from here to here. And it was just like, it's such an intense roller coaster in a little bit of time. I wonder too, if you could talk a little bit. We talked a little bit about Mary Higgins Clark, and we talked a little bit about, some of your research, but if we could talk about some of your literary influences and authors that you love and that have sort of shaped you as a reader and a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I was drawn to crime fiction really early. As a little kid, I wouldn't call it crime fiction. The little whodunits and the mysteries, and I got addicted to. I'm going to the way back now. Those Encyclopedia Brown stories, and it was that, just like what you were talking about, Jenna, like that idea of like when you solve it, it's like, like I was almost there. For people who don't remember those books, it's like it's a little tiny setup, and he's a little kid who works the mysteries of his block, like somebody's sword gets stolen or something. And it'll always be like, and then you flip to the end to get like, how did he figure it out? Like that kind of a thing. And then I found the mixed up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. Loved that. And I was always asking my mom, the librarian who would take me to the library on Saturdays, like, I want more books like this. And I don't even think what to call them, like mysteries. And so she got me on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, and eventually Mary Higgins Clark when I was old enough for that. And so I kind of was, always reading mysteries, as I would call them. But when I was in college, and they were making me read things I didn't want to read, like, do I really need to read Plato? Can I just know who he is? I would go to Powell's on, I don't know if you know about Powell's, like the huge, huge bookstore. And they have a big used books collection, which is all I could afford at the time. And they would have dollar paperback mysteries. And that was kind of the era of those female sleuth-driven series. And so, I found Sue Grafton, and I found Sarah Paretsky, and I found Jan Burke, and I don't know if you wouldn't even remember her. I don't know why she stopped writing. I hope she's well. But Karen Kijewski had this series called like Cat. The main character's name was Cat with a K. And so all the titles were Cat series. And I just consumed those. And I loved these women that kind of started to feel like friends. And I would just binge them. And then after I was caught up, I'm like, oh, I got to wait a whole nother year. And then I every time a new Sue Grafton book came out, it was like, oh, I get to be with Kinsey for a few days. And I would say like those books, I think, were the ones that kind of fed into, my first book was Samantha Kincaid's series. Had the feel of kind of those female-led series books. Michael Connelly and Harlan Coben are two of my favorites too. And I think my books kind of feel like it's like if Harlan, Mike, and Sue Grafton had a baby that was a book, like those might be my books, because they kind of have a little bit of the humor and lightness of a Harlan book and the twistiness of it. And then I think the procedural parts kind of come from, that's a Michael Connelly vibe. And then the characters tend to be like Kinsey-ish, like the Sue Grafton kind of has one dress that she brings out like, for everything kind of gal. Yeah, so that's covering it. Kind of that's the past. That's the past. And in the present, I mean, we are having a moment in crime fiction. I mean, there are so many writers out there that like I don't even want to begin naming them because I'll leave people out. But a Megan Abbott book or a Sean S.A. Cosby book, Laura Littman. I mean, they're doing things that are really creative under, like we said, genre, like in air quotes, that they're shelved under crime fiction, but I don't think people would call them kind of traditional mystery novels.
There's just so much great work being put out right now, and it's so interesting, and it has all those notes that you were saying of these books that we read when we were younger, and we know the beats and it feels familiar, and yet it's like being done in this whole new way with characters that I never could have imagined, falling in love with or falling out of love with, because sometimes I'm like, uh-oh, as I read, but I really think that there's some great things out there, and I'm so excited. I wonder, though, too, if you have sort of a perfect reader or someone who you really hope would like find the note on a table or a bookshelf, or someone that you'd hope to find your work.
Gosh, I don't know how to describe this. I really feel like there's all these people. I think that even if people don't think they like crime fiction, right? If you're reading stuff that you think of as general fiction, but then you find yourself being interested in a mystery at the middle of it, like I think people would wind up liking my books based like that. If you like, this book is very much about female friendships as well.
I love that. There's so much to enjoy and so much to love and so much to be a little bit terrified by in your work as well. I read... No, it's so good. Like I said, I read this in a sitting because I was like, I can't go do anything else until I know how this ends. And I know that for me, that's like a great marker of like, oh, I was really into this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's funny when you said kind of terrifying, well, if you have time for it. I'm happily married to a person who is actually like a normal person and doesn't have dark thoughts like me. Some people who are now our friends, but we would always go to the same hotel and stay in the same place every year. And the family that runs that place, they're like, oh, she's a writer. And they were like, oh, we should read Alafair's books. And they were saying that they were like, I can't, like, sitting around the beach with you having dinner, I would never know that's where your mind lives. I'm like, that's where my mind lives. And then they were like, and like, if I read those books before I met you, I would assume that you were either unmarried or just like plotting to kill your husband at all times. And so now it's become this running joke. Like, my husband's name is Sean. They're like, Sean, how can you sleep next to her at night? Aren't you afraid of her? And he's like, she's not terrifying, I promise.
I love that. There's the art and the artist, and sometimes we can keep them,
it's
separate.
Called
but
imagination.
I know. I love that. I love this sort of world that you get to play in and that you get to invite us all into as well, to have some ups and downs and some crazy moments, but also to really get to meet some great characters and to find some really great messages in there as well about our world. So thank you so much for joining us today.
So really nice to talk to you.
The Note is out now, and I can't wait for everyone to read it.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.